Hi, is everybody here? Should we start? Hello guys, am I audible? Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, hi Paul.
Hi, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have enough presence now. We are already 5 minutes into the meeting, so let's start right away. Yep.
Can someone drop a link to the meeting notes into the chat?
One minute. Here you go.
All right, thanks a lot.
Paul, would you want to share your desktop today, given that you are driving the document?
Yeah, I can do that. I'm rushing in from finishing my lunch, so let me clean up my dirty laundry first.
Okay. You want me to share the desktop instead?
No, that's okay. Just give me a sec.
Sure.
Okay, so we had started on Monday discussing discussion about brainstorming like the different functional areas of federated APIs. Did people think that was a useful discussion? And well, that's right. I think we had talked about resuming that discussion today.
Yep, that's right.
So, oh, that's right. I'm supposed to be sharing my screen. Sorry about that. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep, I can.
I'm gonna just go ahead and drop a link to this into the main notes.
It's at the end of the page or end of the document. Yep.
Oh, okay. It's already in there. All right, great.
Yeah.
So we had gone through a bunch of these since maybe not everybody was on the Monday call. Let's just go through what each of these was briefly that we touched on. So we kind of reorganized this a little bit from talking about it on Monday and broke down the functional areas a little bit further. So templates and overrides basically are like template is the base description of a resource that should go into multiple clusters. Overrides is the concept of enabling certain fields to be differentiated in such a way that they eventually vary in some cluster. And we're agnostic at this level of just like talking about what these things are, about how that's done, whether that's a selector or some other mechanism. Selection seems to be the one that people identify with a lot. So that's what that one is. Placement then is which member clusters a resource or set of resources should exist in. And Greg Harmon, I think you're on the call. I think you had some questions about this. So if you want to call those out and we can clarify them, that might be helpful for other folks too.
Sure. Yeah, I was just sort of trying to figure out how like scheduling fit in with like the overrides. Like, sound like the overrides kind of, or no, I don't know. Between scheduling, propagation, and placement, it seemed like there was some redundancy.
Yeah. So I tried to draw a picture that related these things. Let's talk about the difference between those after we just kind of go over what each one was, and we'll see if we can sort that out. So we're on placement. Placement is which clusters does a resource belong in. So placement is like the knowledge that you want to put deployment X in clusters A, B, and C. Propagation is, now that you know where things need to go, how do they get there? So like propagation refers to like maybe you're running a controller that's actively reconciling and actively putting resources into clusters, or maybe you're running some kind of controller that dumps things into a Git repo that something like kubeapplier then pulls in and reconciles. But it's like propagation is basically the transport mechanism, and surrounding concerns, so like push versus pull, active versus passive reconciliation. Status provides, the next one is status, and that refers to what we all think of as status in Kubernetes APIs. The reason that it's separate, is that we do not necessarily we're not all necessarily going to have the same idea of status. And there's examples in this doc that we can look at when we drill into it. But from our prior discussions in this working group, it seems like there's at least two different schools of thought for what status should look like, and it's probably a spectrum where on one end of the spectrum, there's a camp of, I just want to see some status that like is folded up, all the details of the different clusters are folded up and I don't get exposed to those details. I want some kind of status for a resource that looks similar to what I'd see in Kubernetes. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's the idea that like, I would like to see all the different statuses of all of these different resources in the different clusters in such a way that like, I don't have to drill into each cluster to see the status information, like some kind of status aggregation. And we have been thinking that it might be to avoid a situation where we feel like we have to agree on every element of these things, it might be useful to think of status as being separate resources, so that if I have status flavor A that I identify with and want to use, and Greg has status flavor B that he identifies with, which is different than my own idea, we don't necessarily need to agree. And like Greg and I can implement our own different flavors of resources to show these different flavors of status. And then the last one is scheduling. And scheduling basically is how we refer to the concept of something that is getting placement information, it's getting information about overrides, and it's getting information about the state of member clusters and maybe some other information about things that are happening in the world, and maybe reprogramming overrides and reprogramming placement. So there's kind of a conceptual overlap, but we've been trying to tease out these things as distinct concepts and figure out how they relate to one another. So I'm going to stop talking now because I've been talking for a little bit. Any questions about these before we take a look at this picture, this lovely, elegant diagram which I have inserted into the document there?
Okay, so like, it seems like propagation is getting it somewhere, but so is scheduling. Like, they still seem pretty much like mostly overlapping.
Consider scheduling to be considering the state of the Federation API and the member clusters and determining like dynamically placement and overrides. Propagation is considering template placement overrides to determine what a given resource for a given cluster should appear as, and then looking at the member clusters to determine whether they match, and if not, then updating them. So it's
propagation.
Yeah. So I mean, this isn't necessarily how the implementation would work. I mean, you could have these things kind of conjoined, but the logical separation is just intended to have like, this is the responsibility of scheduling is determine dynamically placement and override values, whereas propagation is really about figuring out what to propagate and whether it needs to be propagated. Sure
okay, so like propagation is sort of a dumb, I'm going to push this stuff to this cluster, and scheduling is the one making sort of decisions about what goes where and perhaps feed the propagation mechanism.
Right. And to be clear, like I said, it could be that you have that all happening kind of in the same process, but by sort of having this be a little bit separate, it just allows for conceptual clarity when we're discussing the different responsibilities.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so can folks see this picture that's on my screen?
Yeah, Paul, you can zoom out the screen a little bit. It'll be more clear to people. Or I think I said.
Is this a little better?
Cool. Yes.
Let me drop this link into the chat and make sure that people can follow on their own screen, since that might be easier to see. So I tried to like relate these things to one another in like a visual way, and the left, starting at the left, which I think is like the most kind of basic thing, is you have some way to specify a template, right? That's universal. Whether that's, and template here is just a placeholder for the concept of you have some base description of a resource that should go into multiple clusters. It occurs to me that the cluster registry isn't on this diagram. Maybe I can throw this into a diagram editor if people think the diagram's useful and add that in. But the most basic concept is you specify some resources, right? So when, and that's kind of in its own swim lane. The next swim lane is about how does that resource get like the description of which clusters that should be in, which is placement, and also how that resource should be differentiated, if at all, when it goes into some clusters, which is overrides. We put those in the same swim lane because they're very closely related, and it's certainly possible that in some in some views they're similar, and maybe they wind up getting conflated, but while we're just agreeing on the view of the problem space, we want to keep them separate. So that's kind of the next layer. And after these first two layers, walking left to right, you've got information about which resources are going to be in which clusters and their final forms after overrides are applied. Like, all that information is described in those first two columns on the left. And after that, there's the question of how do they actually get into the clusters? And that's propagation. So propagation is something that somehow is reconciling the information in those other two columns into the member clusters of a federation. And since that's sort of the description of the very basic elements of the story when we're talking about this, these multi-cluster use cases and federated APIs, let's stop there before I just talk and talk and talk. And I wonder if people think so far the diagram is useful to relate these things.
Yeah, I think it's very useful personally, Quentin here.
Oh, hey, Quentin. Anybody else?
I was wondering, I was thinking sometimes it might make sense to have placement and overrides sort of together. Like if what you're putting somewhere is like, it's like, if you're like canarying something and like, you know, where you're putting it and the values, like, oh, I just wanted like a little bit of traffic there, like those really sort of hand in hand things. I'm a little bit worried about having them like developed separately or evolving separately.
Yeah, I think that it's very likely that we might, it seems inevitable that at least some folks will choose to think of them as being the same thing.
Mm-hmm. But will that...
Just consider, like, if I have an override and it's like replica count equals 0, that's kind of an indication, could be an indication that I don't actually want that replica set in that cluster. But I could also treat that as I want that replica set in that cluster with a replica count of 0, versus placement, which is I want it in versus I don't. So it's, I'm not saying, like, I think Paul's absolutely right that there may be implementations that don't care about that distinction, but by having them logically separate, at least we leave the door open for somebody implementing something that does respect that.
Well, do you think there will be multiple implementations of placement and overrides? Like, I assume that we only need one sort of API.
The goal here is to allow these things to evolve independently, and if someone wants to implement, you know, a different type of placement, then we don't want to be prescriptive and prevent them from doing it. That's not saying that there won't be a default implementation that is sort of one way, but by keeping them separate, we leave the door open for someone swapping that piece out and without having to swap the whole system.
Okay, so I guess as long as it's one option that you can develop a chunk that handles placement and overrides, I guess that would
yeah, there's nothing stopping it from being together, just so long as independently they can be swapped out if desired.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth mentioning that the current implementation actually kind of explicitly has all of these concepts and is all implemented in a single controller per type. So this is more an effort, mostly an effort to just pull those logical pieces apart and enable people to either do what the current implementation is, which is put them all in one big fat controller, or break it up into pieces. And then I presume a user could, use the same API to interact with Federation, but choose the operator of that Federation control plane could decide which controllers to plug in to make all that happen.
Yeah. Yep. And there's also a possibility that, like, say, for example, we chose to implement, as a group, chose to implement, like, resources that align pretty closely to this decomposition. There's also no reason why you couldn't implement something in front of all of this that hid it from users. Or implement like a thicker API in front of this that might just generate other APIs. Does
I think
that
that's
make
I think
sense?
sorry. To me, that's kind of a critical distinction. I mean, Kubernetes is kind of the same way, where I don't think the Kubernetes API is particularly user-friendly, but it's the primitives that allow people to build more usable APIs on top. It has everything you need. You can structure something that works the way you want, that is more suited to your use cases, and that's kind of the same goal here.
I just realized that I have a local Kubernetes cluster that is taking resources away from my video conferencing. So I got some super compressed audio that I couldn't quite make out, but I think what I could understand from it, and it was played at like 3x speed, I think that I agree with it. Yeah, so just at the risk of perhaps repeating what was said and I heard in a very compressed way, like, we're teasing out the functional attributes here. Who knows, like, how we might choose to implement APIs? Like, the key at this point is let's agree on the model of the different functional areas. So below propagation, you'll see status. And that's the aligns to status, as we just talked about, where there may be some baseline, status that everybody agrees on, and maybe Irfan and Maru may, like, as just total examples in the view that I'm getting of the list of people in this room, may, like, maybe Irfan wants X or Y flavor, and Maru wants Z or the first letter in On Beyond Zebra, which I can never remember, flavor. And probably different flavors appeal to different people. So maybe there's multiple implementations of status, but those are collecting information from the member clusters and reporting status that is human and or machine readable. And then the final one kind of cuts across all of these different areas, and that's scheduling. And that, like, here's where I'm going to try to disambiguate things, Greg. So let me know if this makes sense to you. So here's my analogy for scheduling. Like, as a human being, I can be a scheduler. Like, you could not implement anything in the scheduling box and have me at my battle station watching the status of clusters A, B, and C and saying, I need to keep the total replica count for this deployment at 50 across those clusters. So I see that I'm at 10 in cluster A, and I'm at 5 in cluster B, and I'm only at 20 in cluster C. So I'm going to alter the overrides and change the replicas in those clusters. That's me being a scheduler. So like, I think the idea is like, yeah, they overlap. And at least in my own mind, scheduling is like something that's kind of higher level, that's reprogramming overrides and reprogramming placement.
Well, where did the 50 come from? I feel like that should feed into overrides or placement perhaps kind of more statically or be derived from them.
Well, so maybe the 50 is something that like I got a Post-it note as a human scheduler that says, keep the replica count at 50 somehow. And then I can choose to program overrides and placement to make sure that that happens.
So you think like overrides and placements might be more static configuration and scheduling is more the dynamic configuration?
Yeah, exactly. So like placement and overrides seem in this model like they don't have any behaviors except they're like what you see is what you get. Like that's what goes to a cluster. And scheduling is like a thing that programs those.
It sounds to me also like maybe scheduling is like a conceptual way or a box for the feedback loop that has always existed in Federation. It's like a way of making that feedback loop explicit rather than having it be implicit of, oh yeah, there's a status and it updates the placement. No, there's a status that feeds into a scheduler, and the scheduler is the one that's updating the placement. And I think that, for me, I think that's definitely useful to conceive of it that way, because it makes it just a bit more, it helps to make it a bit clearer, I think, for me at least.
So I guess where in the system or I was assuming this is actually going to be software, right? So where is this like, I want 50 total replicas gonna show up somewhere?
So say that you had a resource that was like replica or deployment scheduler, and you say you might program that resource by saying, in this cluster selector, across the clusters in this selector, keep the total replica count at 50. And then the controller that backs that resource could generate placement and overrides that would implement that.
Okay. But then you're overriding overrides, and so therefore they're no longer overrides.
Well, in this model, maybe you as a user don't actually create the overrides yourself. Maybe what you care about is like the high level thing that you program a scheduling resource to do, and it might generate placement and overrides.
I think it's useful to consider overrides to be cluster per cluster variation of the base template. So whether they're defined by a user, whether they're like set by some automatic component, doesn't really matter how they're set. It's just here's how you vary template values by cluster.
So some might be like cluster specific configuration and then the scheduling is more like, here's the runtime dynamic. Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
They're both setting the same values. It's just a different source.
Or they could be setting different values.
Well, when I say the same values, they're setting potentially the same fields. Like if I'm setting a replica count manually by, setting a value on an override resource or somewhere versus the scheduling component setting that same field. Does that make sense?
So like, would you have a scheduler reduce the number of replicas or increase what it saw in overrides? Like, it seems like you wouldn't want to increase it.
Increase the overrides? I mean, if you had a scheduling component, determining your replica count per cluster, it would depend on the scheduling configuration you provided and the state of the clusters that it's monitoring. I'm not sure. Does that answer your question, or am I speaking across purposes?
So if you had an override that said, oh, I want to have 10 replicas in this cluster, would you have scheduling say, oh, there's not enough replicas, let me increase it above 10?
Yes, potentially. If say you wanted 20 replicas across your 2 member clusters, and the capacity in one of your clusters prevented there being an equal balance, so you couldn't actually do 10 in each, you could only do 8 in one. If you said I wanted 20 total, then the scheduler would say, well, I have to increase this one to 12 to meet that constraint. So I would think that if you were running a scheduler, whatever manually defined overrides you'd set would be superseded by anything the scheduler decided. I mean, really, there wouldn't be much point in setting a manual override if you were using a scheduling component to control it. But the explicit requirement to have a scheduling preferences resource associated with a given template, that would be the only reason the scheduler would act. So that if you did not have that scheduling preferences or some sort of default configuration that said, schedule me even if I don't have that resource, then chances are you would just respect the manual override if one existed. So it gives the user flexibility.
Okay. Yeah, I think I see that.
It sounds to me like if we look at the other things, the template, the placement, the overrides, it sounds like the scheduler is kind of an add-on component to a basic federation. You could run a federation without a scheduler. You could just run a federation that has templates, placements, and overrides defined, and is not at all doing anything active with status results. So I think it makes sense to me now why the scheduler is outside of the swim lanes, because it really seems like it's almost in some ways it's like doing your analogy of a human. It almost is like it's an automated human user. It's kind of interacting with the federation similarly to how a human would be interacting with the rest of the components of the federation.
I mean, I think it's useful to think about that conceptually. There's nothing stopping someone from just internalizing that and not actually exposing that, but at least this gives a logical model that can be used for both something that's where it's explicit, separated out, and one where it's implicit and just done in a pipeline of some kind. I mean, for me, I can think of a use case where all I want to do is copy the same resource to every cluster. I'll just mirror copies, and all I need is the template. And then I want to be able to have per cluster variation, and I need templates and overrides. And if I want placement, then I can actually decide, things go to a cluster or not. I need a template and placement. And so it's kind of composable. And maybe it would make sense if a user just wanted to have the simplest possible system, they just wouldn't use a given piece. Like, I don't need that. I'm just going to not run that controller, or I'm going to disable that feature. And that's just kind of in response to concerns that have been raised by various users, like, I don't want this feature. I worry that this is something that I don't want to run operationally. At least this gives an opportunity for an implementation to exist that just doesn't use that feature at all, doesn't include it.
Yeah, that makes reasonable sense to me. One comment that I guess we should perhaps just bear in mind is, on the one extreme, we have an API, which is, you create a single thing. Let's call it a federated replica set, for example. And inside there is all the information that all of these components would need. Possibly some of those areas optional. So like if I didn't want to do overrides or didn't want to do placement, then the section that specifies how to do overrides or placement would just be missing in a given creation. And then possibly the controllers that do that stuff would also be missing. So that's on the one end of the spectrum, we could take that approach. On the other end of the spectrum, we could end up with a situation where we have, a large number, let's say 5 or 6 or 7 API objects, which collectively cause the desired end result. So we could have a template thing, and then we could have a placement directives thing, and we could have a scheduler. I'm talking about API objects now, and we could have to specify like 6 of these things to have it work properly. And I think that would potentially make the world more complicated than the people who want to use the full functionality want. And I guess maybe an analogy might be, so in Kubernetes at the moment you have replica sets, and you can just create one of them, and it tells you, it specifies how many of the replicas you want and the properties, etc. And then, one step up from that, you have an autoscaler, and that'll then basically control that thing for you and change the number of replicas, and implicitly or explicitly the autoscaler is more powerful than the things that you put in your replica set, in that it overrides them. I'm babbling on a bit. I guess what I'm cautioning is that I'm a little nervous that we might end up with too many different API objects with complex interrelationships between them to achieve a relatively simple outcome. And I guess my preference might be that we try and put some amount of useful stuff in the core object that gets created, with fields being optional for those people who don't want to use them, to prevent that proliferation of API objects problem.
I think that's a completely valid concern. I think the goal wasn't to say, yeah, we want all these API objects. It was more to have a degree of separation so that potentially we could have like an alpha phase where different sort of implementations of a given concept were kind of attempted, implemented, tested, discarded, but probably with the eventual goal of like cleaning it up and optimizing it for actual use. Maybe the one caveat being, I think there, at least the sort of thought process I have around placement, and I think we've had discussions about this, is that it might actually be useful to have that separate, because then if you had, say, a given application that you wanted to deploy to a set of clusters, you could have placement directive that applied, label selector or something, rather than having to define that in every single resource. But certainly for things that have direct relationships, like status, like overrides, like scheduling preferences, it's less clear that having those separate over the long term will actually have value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, I totally agree.
Yeah, so Quentin, I also think that I identify and empathize with what you're saying, and I have been thinking of like, I guess I already mentioned this a little bit ago, but just to expand on it, like I also think that it would be possible to have like a simpler API conceptually. Like say that we did wind up implementing API resources that like aligned with these. Let's see, it looks like 6 boxes, and we wind up with 6 API resources. I think it is totally valid to consider implementing something that like gives a simpler view, like closer to what the current federation does. I don't think that I see no reason why those two can't coexist.
Yeah, that's an absolutely valid observation. And I had a similar thought actually a little earlier when we were talking about, propagation and these kind of things. I could imagine a lower layer underneath what we've been talking about here, where you just create a normal Kubernetes object in a federation control plane with a specifier for which cluster you want it to go to, and it goes and does that. And then some of these higher level abstractions we build on top of that basic stuff. And some people might just use the basic stuff. They don't want to have to go to 27 clusters to go and do their thing. They just want to do that all against one API and have the controller propagate that stuff.
Yeah, and so I've had a similar thought. The difference in the thought that I've had would be like, you could put that, you could also, so I think you're right. Like that is definitely one possibility. I think you could also put it at the other end. So like you could stick a facade, like, oh, I guess I'm not sharing my screen. It doesn't really matter. So like to the left of everything in the diagram, you could stick a facade that looks very much like the current federation does in front of all that too, and use everything that way. There are a number of different possibilities where you can get that kind of view, I think.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so we have 17 minutes left. Do folks want to like drill into status, or I think that's one that we haven't really drilled into, like examples of different flavors of. So that might be something that we can do. What should we tackle next in this discussion?
Maybe if people have outstanding questions or concerns about any of the stuff we've been discussing, chances are you're not the only one, so please speak up.
I was interested in talking about what happens if you have like two placement directives, placement directives that like sort of interfere with each other, like whether you like and them all or them all, or how we want them to handle that.
I mean, I put in 2 suggestions, and it seemed like maybe you preferred the union of the results. And Torin, who's, I'm not sure if he's on the call, but he's responsible for integration with OPA, the policy engine. He was kind of concerned at the use maybe of selectors for defining what you were applying placement to. And I think I kind of, if I understand his concern correctly, it's that if you're automatically applying using policy to define placement, maybe a selector is not good enough, for lack of a better term. What's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's not definitive enough. I can have a selector that says all countries in the US, but really I mean this specific resource needs to go in this cluster or can't go into this cluster. And so the selectors is what raises the possibility of more than one placement resource applying to a given template resource. And so in that case, we need some resolution mechanism, but I just want to sort of bring it back to the idea that maybe selector isn't always the best fit. Like, it might be the best fit if you're a user and you're declaring your placement intent, because that gives you more flexibility. But maybe for administrative reasons, you want less flexibility. You want direct relationship so that there's no ambiguity and people can't change it easily. Your labels.
While I'm thinking about it, I realized that like policy is actually not reflected on this diagram. And I think it might be really profitable to have like either have a breakout session or I don't want to mispronounce the person's name that you mentioned, Maru, but perhaps it would be like good to have a session, a group session, like just on policies and like open policy engine, I think it's called, or open policy agent. I am not confident that I actually understand all of what that can do. So it would be great to get educated on that.
There's a TLDR on that, which is given a resource with specific labels, you define, like, you kind of translate those labels into placement directives. So I'm supposed to be going into, or like I'm some critical function, and all critical functions have to be done in the country that my company is located in. And so you translate, the cluster selector to make sure that it's going into clusters with those characteristics. Does that make sense? Like that's what it is today. I'm not saying that. I certainly think it's profitable. It would be profitable to have a discussion with him and engage him in this brainstorming. It's more that, like, as far as the current state of federation and what policy does, I believe it's strictly about placement.
I was going to ask whether, so I've looked at the expression language that you can use to describe policies, and it looked to me in the examples that I looked at that it was mostly dealing with placement, but I have wondered to myself whether there's like another facet of policy that might deal with like amount of workloads that you can run in particular places, which I guess ultimately comes back to placement.
No, you're right. I mean, I think it could be that you enforce any kind of administrative oversight. Like you could say all, things in this country of this type have to use this image, right? Like there's all kinds of different things you could apply. In today, it seems like it's very specifically targeted at placement, but I could see it being expanded, and probably the same argument. I think the only thing is like placement is the only one so far we've said, oh, well, it might make sense to have a placement apply to multiple resources and use a selector to do so. I don't think there's any concern, with an override that's specifically tied to a single resource. Like that should just work. But I'm sorry, Greg, we're getting away from your question. I want to make sure that you're satisfied with the answer, or if you
Yeah, so I guess I hadn't really seen that use case or thought about that use case yet. So I think it makes sense that we shouldn't have a way to implement that with whatever we design here.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, I mean, I commented on the doc, and hopefully we can get feedback from Toron, but maybe it makes sense to have kind of two flavors where, you can specify a selector or an object reference, like one or the other, and that at least gives a little bit more specificity, less room for error if you're applying policy. So a selector allows you to, apply to multiple resources, but then it, if it's label based, then if a user has access to the resource, they can change the labels and effectively change how the policy is applied. But if it's a direct object reference and the user doesn't have the ability to change the placement, like they're not allowed to do that, then they wouldn't be able to override or change the administrative intent. Does that make sense?
Well, it seems like that's starting to get into like ACLs and RBAC and things.
It kind of is. I mean, we're not really, I think that's kind of a separate discussion. We kind of want to enable administrators to apply our back policy to this API in a useful way. We're not really digging into it yet because we kind of want to nail down what's required to just drive, the whole thing. But it is certainly in our mind that we want to be able to have security, and policy is kind of tied in with that, because if you want policy to be applied, do you want it to be optionally applied or do you want it to be mandatory? And if it's mandatory, then things like RBAC will have to come into play.
Yeah, I guess I just mean like the API, I don't think we have to make the mandatory policy in the API or
right. I mean, the mandatory nature would simply be an admission controller that was, obeying, like configured via policy to apply certain placement directives. And then the mandatory would be preventing like anybody but someone who is an administrator from changing that. And like I said, it's kind of out of band from what we're talking about here. The only real concern is if the association is via selector, then it might not be capable of being enforced.
So one question that I have, and I'm curious to know if anybody on this call happens to know the answer to this, is whether, so I believe in the current Federation, the policy integration is implemented as an admission controller. Does that admission controller ever reject things and say, the policy forbids you from placing this workload where you said it should be placed?
Good question. Does anybody know?
No, I don't think so that admission controller rejects any of whatever is submitted as a policy. So it will try to formulate the annotations. It can either formulate correct annotations and put that on the object, or it can fail to do that. But the whatever user has submitted at that point of time, it won't say anything.
Yeah, that kind of matches the impression that I got, which is that if you run the submission controller, it basically says, it's very nice that you said you wanted this. The policy gives you this. That's what you get.
Yep, something like that.
I had a quick comment about the what we want to deal with next. I was going to suggest that we try and at the appropriate time. So at some point we're going to feel like we've got a reasonable consensus of the overview, these boxes on the diagram, etc., and perhaps the granularity of the API, etc. And I think it would be really useful to be able to carve off pieces that we can actually make a semi-final decision on, so people can start coding without having the risk of us coming back and saying, oh, we've changed our minds on that. And the other failure mode might be that we just keep on talking about these things until we've reached consensus on every little detail before we can start writing code. So that was a long-winded way of saying, I think we should prioritize like carving up pieces that can be done soon and get going on them.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Quentin. One thing that comes to mind as immediately actionable would be like status. I don't think you need like status could very well be useful independently of all of the rest of this stuff. And I also will just share that like I think iteration is king, and I think if we kind of agree on the generalities, then there shouldn't be anything stopping us from doing prototyping, right? Like everything in Kubernetes conceivably or conceptually starts out as alpha. So there shouldn't be anything really standing in our way from trying to see what do these things look like if we try to do like a very simple limited implementation scope to like secrets, config map, and deployments, for example, or secrets, config map, and replica set. I personally have spent a lot of time in the last like 15 months or so feeling in another problem domain like I was blocked by analysis paralysis a lot of the time. So I am all about trying to make progress by iteration. And I don't think that we have to agree on all the details to try to iterate either. So big plus one to what you said, Quentin.
Sounds good.
So we're almost at time for today. One thought I have had is that like if people are really interested in making rapid progress, we probably ought to talk more frequently than once a week. I'm actually going to be traveling, I think, next Monday, but how do folks feel about having another session maybe sometime in the next week before the next working group meeting, if we want to try to identify areas to prototype?
Yeah, I'm keen on that.
Yep, same here.
Maybe same time slot as we had this week with Monday. Does that work for folks?
Yep, sounds good to me.
Okay. I'll take the action item to, excuse me, to send an invitation out for Monday at the same time.
Yeah, and before we break out, I was listening to all this conversation about the functional blocks or whatever. Does it make sense to segregate these in something like which is a static information and the other is something which is dynamic or live? For example, scheduling is already secluded out that it is dynamic. I think propagation also has some scope where there could be a active reconcile stuff or actual controller which is looking for objects in the cluster and reconciling the tail, or it might be one-time kubectl apply kind of a stuff. So to me, those two things seem to be active or dynamic, and rest of the information specified here is static information which can actually be shaped into an API. Does that sound reasonable?
Are you? I think the distinction maybe was mentioned by Quentin or Christian in the doc. I just want to make sure maybe that we're both covering those bases where there's like the specifying, but then there's the actual like controllers. And so separating out like specification from controllers, and controllers having like different types, like you say, like being active reconciler versus just generated configuration. Those are definitely sort of different areas that could be worked on independently, if that's what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think it also sort of helped the sort of conceptual, or being newer to this, it helped me understand like, what's what, and draw that clear more clearly.
Cool.
Okay, yeah, we can continue on this discussion on Monday, coming Monday then.
Cool. Thanks all.
Okay, I have sent a message or a calendar invite for next Monday. I am going to be traveling. I will try to make it personally, but I may not be able to attend next Monday. But the invitation is there.
Okay.
All right. See you, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
See you
Paul.
guys.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye.